Chris, welcome to the Gnostic Media Podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. It's a pleasure to be here.
And I appreciate you coming on. Your publisher had sent me a copy of your new book, The Secret History of Rock and Roll, a few weeks ago, and having read it, I came across many similarities to my own work that you had tied into the modern rock and roll movement, specifically regarding the ancient mysteries. And so I wanted to have you on the show. And why don't you start out by telling us a little bit about yourself and how your educational background and how you got into this field of study?
My educational background was filled with immersion, real-life immersion into music and media and things like that. I grew up, my mother was a professional musician. From a very early age, she was a prodigy. And I spent a lot of time in nightclubs and concert halls and conservatories and things like that. She was a classically trained singer and pianist. So that was an interesting way to sort of start off my life. She also played in church. She played the pipe organ in church and in a Jewish temple. So I had a bit of an interesting immersion in that world as well. I spent a lot of time when I wasn't in nightclubs, either in church or in temple. So that was a very interesting environment to sort of begin my life in. Later on, in my teenage years, I got involved in the hardcore punk scene in Boston. One of those magical times in history. That was a great time to be a teenager, a smart teenager, I guess. There's a lot of really exciting things going on. I saw a lot of the great punk rock and new wave bands that rolled into town and was really involved in this counterculture, this secret world of hardcore punk. And later on, when I began studying the ancient mysteries, it really informed my work, my experience in this counterculture, because it was very much in the book I tie it to the Mithraic mysteries, because the Mithraic mysteries were in some ways the most similar to hardcore punk in that they were very rigid, very moralistic, very didactic, very dualist, very violent and confrontational as well. So that was an interesting experience. Wasn't necessarily what I listened to when I went home. I was more interested in a lot of experimental post-punk, electronic music, things like that. But it was a very exciting time, an exciting place to be. It's a good place to expend all that teenage energy. Later on, I went to art school and studied cartooning and graphic art, and found myself about the age of 20 working in New York, doing merchandising, artwork, licensing artwork, things like that. And that was a very interesting experience as well, sort of seeing the other end of the spectrum, but also seeing how ideas are packaged, how they're processed, how they're sent to market, how they live and how they die. For instance, I saw how the Warner Brother characters, the cartoon characters, went from being sort of hip and edgy to being the most boring, overexposed things on the face of the planet. And that taught me a very important lesson in how things are over-marketed, overexposed. And I was doing a lot of that work. That's a whole other story. But I did some comics work, got involved in a magazine called Comic Book Artists, which was a very popular fanzine. I worked there as an associate editor and also as a columnist, sort of op-ed columnist and feature writer. Kept a blog on the Clash, wrote a book called Clash City Showdown, which was a collection of writings from the blog. And that led to a gig with a British magazine called Classic Rock, in which I wrote some features. One of the main features I wrote was called Lucifer Rising, Symphony for the Devil. And I interviewed Kenneth Anger and Bobby Beausoleil. And Jimmy Page was also interviewed for the piece. It was a big cover story on Jimmy Page's involvement with Kenneth Anger and the whole story of that film, starting with the earliest incarnations in 1966 up into Invocation of My Demon Brother, and then the various adventures through the 70s. That led to a book contract with Red Wheel Weiser. I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with that company. Writing a book called Our Gods Wear Spandex, The Secret History of Comic Book Heroes. That in turn led to another gig doing sort of a dream project for me, co-writing the official book on the X-Files called The Complete X-Files. And that sort of leads up to the present, in which I wrote the Secret History of Rock and Roll.
Well, why don't we segue for a little bit here into your book, Our Gods Wear Spandex. How did you tell us about that? What's that all about?
Basically, the idea behind that book is how sort of all these ideas and concepts from ancient mythology wound up in the comic books. And it didn't just happen. There was an interesting midwife period, and that's the sort of the occult explosion of the Industrial Revolution and Victorian era. And what that book was sort of looking at how a lot of these mystical groups and the spiritualists and theosophists and the Golden Dawn and just the Freemasons, all these sort of esoteric, even groups like the Mormons, we're taking all these ideas from ancient mythology, particularly, Greco-Egyptian, that whole nexus of mythology, and incorporating it into basically a new kind of pop religion. It's kind of like an Andy Warhol religion. And in turn, that filters down into the pulp magazines, because a lot of the pulp writers were involved with groups like the Golden Dawn or the Rosicrucians. I mean, we're talking about people like Talbot Mundy, people like Dion Fortune, people like Sax Rohmer. These people were all initiates. These people all traveled in these circles. And out of this, they created this new kind of fiction, superhero fiction. Because we sort of think this starts with Superman, Batman, et cetera, but really those characters particularly are rip-offs, direct rip-offs of earlier characters that are created by people who have a much deeper knowledge of this whole collision between pop occultism and popular culture. And that's really something that I'm just continue to be fascinated in. I would love to write another book that would sort of delve deeper into the pulp era, because that to me is much more interesting. I mean, a lot of the guys who created comic books were basically kids who were just imitating what they had read in the pulps. And the pulps are where a lot of people who had studied and who had practiced and had been involved in ritual magic, you name it, were it was all gelling. It was, the times, the zeitgeist was playing into this, but it was this really fantastic moment in history when a new idea, you can sort of trace it back to the ancient gods, you can kind of trace it back to the ancient heroes, some of the great epics and some of the great myths and everything, but it's new, but it's also, the lifeblood of it, the lifeblood of all of this is all these ideas that were germinating in the counterculture of the early 20th century. Particularly groups like the Rosicrucians, particularly groups like the sort of the rump end of the Theosophists. It's this hand-me-down process that ends up, in the superheroes. And that's why today there's so much of this stuff, it's more explicit now. Really, the top three writers, in many ways in comic books are Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, and Grant Morrison. And these guys are very well versed in all this. They put it in their stories very explicitly. They understand what they're talking about. They're almost taking it back to the roots. And I really wanted to explore this process. And I also wanted to explore this process where superheroes today are much more lofty and serious and almost kind of humorless idea than they were when I was a kid. You're not going to see the Batman TV show anymore. People are insulted by that because they take Batman very seriously. Batman has a very deep meaning to them. Batman is almost a god in many ways. And if you sort of subscribe to this idea that, the more savvy ancient people didn't necessarily see these these gods and whatnot as real figures, but as expressions of archetypes and things like that. I mean, it is very much the same process. So I really wanted to explore how exactly this happened. And, publishing being what it is today, where, they think that 50,000 words is taxing the reader's attention. I wasn't able to really get into the nitty-gritty as much as I had wanted to, which is why, this is definitely a topic that I'm going to to revisit, because I think that we really take for granted how strange and weird and how different our culture is today. The best parts of our culture. I mean, there's all the garbage, of course, which is just heinous and worthless. But, things like superheroes, things like sci-fi.
Yeah, why don't you tell us specifically some of the connections you made with some of the superheroes?
Well, what I had sort of done is I wanted to look at the basic archetypes of the heroes, because they all can sort of be broken down into, basically a handful of categories. And one of which is the Messiah. And this is Hercules. Hercules, very interesting. And I know you've spoken to people like Acharya, and you understand that Hercules, was Jesus Christ before Jesus was Jesus, right? That people swore to Hercules and made oaths to Hercules and all that sort of thing.
Right.
So, I mean, Hercules...
And many other gods before that, too.
Exactly. But Hercules is sort of the first great pop worldwide Messiah, isn't he? I mean, he's the first universal Messiah figure that people all over the world, or the known world, as it were. I mean, I've heard that, even as far east as China, that they recognized Hercules. So Hercules is sort of the great first universal Messiah figure. And the fascinating thing about Hercules is how he reincarnates as Superman, and how this is, very much a conscious process that Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, who created Superman, were really, they were big Hercules buffs. They were big mythology buffs. A lot of the early covers of Superman comics are basically taking, particularly sort of the Renaissance depictions of Hercules, and just putting Superman in his place and putting a Nazi tank or warship in place of, the lion or the bull, or, you know what I'm saying? All these sort of great forces of nature. Because Hercules is really the character that represents the taming of nature. He's the solar messiah that makes the world safe from the threats of nature that was...
And darkness.
Yes, exactly. Well, darkness is, part of nature, right? So the second character is Batman, who's, just as Superman comes from a character named Doc Savage, Batman is really just a repackaging of the Shadow. Same thing with the millionaire playboy avenging crime by night, things like that. And
that theme's been redone over and over as well.
Oh yeah, ad infinitum.
Yeah, just like in the new Iron Man.
Yeah. Well, what I trace this back to is the Golem. That the Golem is this figure. If the Messiah is this sort of altruistic savior figure, the Golem is this figure of revenge, of vengeance. And that's really what Batman is. Batman is an avenger. I mean, Superman is the guy who will save the world before the world really needs saving. And Batman's kind of the guy who cleans up the mess after all the damage has been done. Then there's also the Amazon figure. And the Amazon figure, of course, Wonder Woman is the great example of this, and she sort of ties back to a lot of the warrior goddesses of the ancient world. Again, very, very consciously. I mean, her creator was very well versed, and
Yeah, and then even in the TV show, she would fly back to the Amazon island in the invisible jet or something to talk with the other women, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you know,
okay.
she's created by Aphrodite, and her great enemy is Mars/Ares. Okay, so you know, Wonder Woman, her origin and her early stories are really suffused with this ancient mythology. You know, it's a very conscious process. But she's a very interesting figure too, because there's a lot of sort of, I guess, gender ambiguity about these Amazon figures, because don't forget that these characters are sort of being mostly read by boys or men, and they're identifying with this female hero. So there's a lot of interesting sort of subtext that goes on there, where you see these superheroines who are basically men in drag, you know, that they don't act like women, they don't think like women, they see the world through a male lens more. It's become a very potent archetype today.
Right, yeah. What is it that makes a cartoon character in drag so exciting in a comic book?
Well, what I sort of tie it back to, and I think this is very important, is that we're seeing this through the eyes of the fan and the reader. Again, and then that's sort of the last of the first four archetypes. I also have the wizard archetype in there, and we see that today, you know, being so popular with Harry Potter and things like that. But there's also the Brotherhood, you know, the Justice League, the X-Men, the Avengers. But really, what this is that the Messiah is daddy, the Amazon is mommy. The Brotherhood, you know, the team is our fantasy of our friends, of, you know, being surrounded by powerful outsiders. And the Golem character is sort of the reader who feels marginalized, who feels that something needs to be avenged, put upon, you know, people who sort of gravitate towards this. And the other point that I was making in the book as well is that the reason why the superhero archetype is so popular these days is that everybody feels marginalized. Everybody feels vulnerable. You know, it's these feelings that were sort of once delegated to the schoolyard wallflower or what have you, has become much more potent in the society at large. And this is really, I think, what's feeding this immense popularity, that superheroes are much more popular than they've ever been. You know, even, you know, people sort of point to World War II, but really, this is the golden age of superheroes, with these films making billions of dollars all around the world. This has become a very potent archetype, and it has to do with social conditions. And I think in a lot of ways, it reminds me back, you know, going back to the sort of the birthplace of all of this in the Industrial Revolution. I mean, the same social pressures and anxieties that fed this process that resulted in a lot of these mystical groups, secret societies, alternative religious movements. You know, the same conditions exist today. And rather than, you know, feeding into that so much, it's feeding into these very potent archetypes in the popular culture.
It's a fascinating story.
Yeah, it's really, you know, in many ways, I keep waiting for this whole thing to sort of end, and it just keeps going and going. I mean, it just keeps picking up. You know, the culture that I was so immersed in as a kid has become the mainstream culture now. It's kind of disorienting in a way.
What was the key factor that got you investigating the ancient mysteries?
I don't know. I've always been really interested in countercultures. You know, I was always interested in reading about, you know, say, for instance, the 60s counterculture or the 20s counterculture. I mean, 20s is a really fascinating period as far as the rise of countercultures, because you had this entire generation of people who were so incredibly disillusioned by the First World War. And, you know, you had places like Paris and Frankfurt, where just so much, or Berlin as well. You know, there's this brilliant counterculture that rose up. Dada and Surrealism, you know, were huge influences on me. But, you know, having this immersion experience into religion, you know, I've always been interested in religion, but, you know, not the mainstream religion, I got interested in the Gnostics. And Gnosis magazine, I really got to give them a shout out. I think that's a magazine, Jay Kinney's magazine from the early 90s on. I think it's something that is very much undervalued today, and it makes me very sad because that was a tremendous magazine. One of these things that I really looked forward to, each new issue, because I was going to really learn something and point me in a lot of different directions and point me to books that I should go out and read. That was an amazing experience. You remember that magazine, right?
I don't remember it, actually.
Oh, you don't? Oh,
no.
Oh, Gnosis magazine was a fantastic magazine. Kind of ran out of gas the last year or so, but if you just do a search on Gnosis magazine on Google or whatever, I mean, they still have a lot of the articles up, and it was really just a fantastic magazine. And I just, somewhere along the lines, I just started reading about the ancient mysteries, and I'm not exactly sure when it really picked up, but I know that I guess a little later on, your film, The Pharmacratic Inquisition. The Pharmacratic Inquisition had a great influence on me in a lot of ways. This was, obviously a little more recently, but it really helped tie together a lot of the ideas that I explore in the book, and that's this whole role of entheogens bringing forth these subconscious contents into the culture that we saw, with the rise of the mysteries, say in the middle of the first millennium BCE, and then how this sort of repeated itself with the rise of LSD and things like that, and the mushroom trail that the beatniks were on. It's just fascinating to me, how things just repeated, and how things just came back and cycled back in. I was a huge Castaneda fan as well.
Why don't we get into your book, The Secret History of Rock and Roll, and tell us a little bit about the premise of the book, first off.
The basic premise of the book is that rock and roll is really nothing new, that it's just it's a revival. It's a resurrection. It's not an invention. It's a reinvention of something that just dates back a very, very long time. And I'd argue that it goes all the way, goes back all the way to the Stone Age. That rock and roll was, when people would gather around after a hunt and bang on the drums and dance and boast of their prowess with the spear. That is really where rock and roll begins. Wherever people were getting inebriated and dancing and screwing, rock and roll is there. Yeah. I think that a lot of ideas that came up with Christianity and whatnot, this whole idea of linear time, of history being sort of this progression towards this goal, extended into music. That music became all about, classical music is a great example. That classical music became more and more complex and less about what music is supposed to be about, which is dancing and singing, and a communal experience. The church was very enthusiastic about banning all the great aspects of music, drums. They even, believe it or not, they banned the major scale for a certain period of time. The tritone is a great example that everybody's familiar with. The devil's octave or something like that. I forget. The devil's interval, it's called.
Right.
So just as the church and monotheism in general suppressed a whole host of cultural expressions for so many years, the same thing happened with rock and roll. That rock and roll, something that we would very much recognize as rock and roll, existed in the ancient mysteries. And the ancient mysteries are sort of this amorphous idea in a lot of people's minds. But when you look at the descriptions of the ancient mysteries and the cult places at the different cult centers around the ancient world, the rituals themselves, it all centered on dance, singing, light shows, inebriation. Some of the more wild cults, the Dionysians, there's a lot of public sex and things like that. I mean, it was very much, when people use the term Dionysian, they don't necessarily understand what that means. It's become just sort of a cliche, but it's part of this cultural expression that was very, very popular. And with a lot of cases, the mysteries of Demeter, the mysteries of Isis, the mysteries of Cybele, and Mithras, certainly in the late Roman period, that these were very well regarded among the intellectuals and as far as the cognitive elite. You even had people like Hadrian, who was initiated into the mysteries of Demeter. So, but well, people will say, "Oh, we don't know what they were doing. It's it was all secret. It was all mysterious." That's not true at all. I mean, there were whole scores of written records of these rituals, and that's really what I went back and read. I just as often as I could, I read the original accounts. Strabo was a great source for the Grecian versions of this. Of course, this is all over the ancient world, particularly in the Roman era. I sort of tend to believe that a lot of this originates in Phrygia, that the Phrygians were these very passionate and fiery people. And of course, we know that Cybele, Attis, maybe in some cases Mithras. I mean, Mithras is a whole other kettle of fish. I tend to think that Mithras was not necessarily who he's advertised as. But there was this great culture, among these wild mountain people, passionate, vibrant musical culture, musical religious culture. And it became so intoxicating to people, as this sort of gradually moves west, first into Greece, then into Rome. And then there's a parallel tradition. It's a bit different than the Greek mysteries are a bit different than what we see down in Egypt, that the Egyptian mysteries are not quite as countercultural. The stories, the great rituals of Isis and Osiris, that this is very much a mainstream part of the culture. I think what I argue in the book is that the mysteries themselves are really a reaction to the boring, dry, formalized cults of state. But by this time, say in the middle of the first millennium BCE, these patriarchal gods have just really lost their luster, and they sort of become with an authoritarianism that sort of runs counter to the move towards individualism that's starting to arise at this time. And I think that's what finds expression in the mysteries. And of course, you have the first explosion of this in some ways, the Dionysians, the Bacchanalia, these wild women in the hills, really breaking the laws of nature, as it were. I mean, these people are seen as just complete outlaws of just flying in the face of everything that the male authorities believe in. But at the same time, we have this move where mankind is just beginning to bring nature to heel, beginning to not be quite so completely subject to the whims of nature. And writers have argued that the pederasty that sort of grew out of this is the males looking to other males, particularly this ideal of this Apollonian ideal, that it's in part it's a reflection of the domination and the rejection of nature, which is always seen, right, as feminine. It's always seen as a woman. Rhea, Gaia, Kybele, whoever. The Earth Mother is always seen not only as a woman, but as sort of a capricious and cruel woman.
Right, and many stories of, or many records of shamans show them as cross-dressers and the like as well.
Well, that's the interesting thing, with the mysteries of Kybele. Dionysus, a lot of the men who gravitate towards this, it's basically a woman's mystery. So a lot of the men, will become cross-dressers, will become eunuchs. They feminize themselves. And the greatest expression of this, though, the purest expression of this is the Galloi, the priests of Attis, who dress as women, who castrate themselves, quite violently, who have these really extreme, intense ritual, with music and flagellation and cutting, all these sort of things. One of the things that I noticed is that they had invented headbanging. The descriptions of their dancing, they had these long braids and they would swing them around in time to the music. When you read the descriptions of these rituals, you know that this music is not just what you might see in an old sword and sandal movie. The sort of fake light classical with sort of a drum beat to it. The words like frenzied, thunderous, all these violent adjectives are identified with this. And there are all these sort of different expressions, but the thing that really fascinates me is the commonalities between them. They're not, Isis and Kybele and Demeter. They might be different figures in some ways, but they're expressions of the same forces of nature, and of course, Osiris and Dionysus are come to be seen as the same figure. Apollo and Horus, Isis and Demeter. It all becomes. I'm really fascinated by syncretism. I'm really fascinated by how these things all sort of coalesce and hybridize. That to me is what I'm really fascinated in. And it's this very brief time, before the rise of, I guess, the therapeutes and the Neoplatonists, a more philosophical, sort of this move towards, this very arid monotheism. But there was this really great, rich mix of the mysteries and the Gnostics and, everything that you can name, sort of just colliding and exchanging ideas and things like that. This all sort of centers in Alexandria. And, it seems to me such a shame that it was so short-lived, but it was a fantastically rich time in our history.
Yeah, and I think the Eleusinian mysteries lasted for over 1,000 years.
Oh, they held on to the bitter end.
Yeah, to say the least, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was one of the great, well, not necessarily great, but I think it was Alaric, one of these warlords, these Gothic warlords that had taken over Rome, had personally smashed up the temple at Eleusis. The Telestrion had personally seen that it was shut down because even in the midst of the rise of monotheism, that Demeter somehow had this power and this prestige that was able to withstand it. Same thing with Isis. And of course, I mean, it's no news flash to your readers that Isis was just basically adopted as the Virgin Mary. I mean, it's the same,
right?
The same clothing even. It's the same figure. They just changed the names on the icons. It wasn't as interesting. But They had a new world order to build. They had a one world government to put into place, and you needed a one world religion. So you needed to do away with all these other cultural expressions, and kill off their priests and their people if they don't go along with the program.
That's very true. All right, who were the Corybantes?
Oh boy, they're my favorites. I love these guys. A lot of different names. They were basically Judas Priest of the ancient world. They were these, and it's interesting too because you have these parallel tracks where you have the priesthood and then you have the mythological version. Where the mythological version are guarding either Zeus or Dionysus, from the wrath of the gods, and Kronos or the Titans. But basically, they're these guys who get together and have these big drums and these big stringed instruments, flutes, and they just make this horrendous racket. I mean, this incredible thundering noise. And they have torches going, and they dance in time to the music with it, and bang their swords and shields, and they sing till their throats are raw. I mean, it's heavy metal. It's exactly heavy metal. Every description you read of the Carits or the Corybantes or the Dactyls or the Caballeri, you name it, it's heavy metal. It's amazing. They're dressed in hoplite armor, which of course is made of leather. Judas Priest hellbent for leather. I mean, it's just it was such an incredible discovery, and I can't believe that nobody's ever pointed out that that this is heavy metal. The way all these very sober and serious historians are describing this stuff. It reads like an old Iron Maiden fanzine. It was so hilarious. It was just brilliant. And I just did an interview for this VH1 documentary on heavy metal. They wanted me to talk about this, and I'm like, metalheads, hold your heads up high. You guys have been around for thousands of years. You were around before anybody else. And it's really true. It's just an amazing story. And on the other side of that, the Galloi are the glam rockers. When you read about them, it's like reading about an old Sweet concert or something. Nothing changes.
Yeah. Well, hopefully they don't still cut their nuts off and go throw them through house windows and things.
Yeah, boy. That was that's quite an interesting. That's how they recruited. They would hold these big public ceremonies, and actually the Corybantes / Carits / whatever, would sort of be the backup band, and the Galloi would scream and shake their heads around and start cutting themselves with pot shards and everything like that. And I read this description of this guy jumps out of the crowd and cuts his nuts off. Sometimes it'd go for the whole package, and the whole thing is that you had to throw it through somebody's door, and I guess that was like some sacred thing for them. It's like so gruesome, but that's how intense these people were. Life and death were a very thin line separating the two back then. These people were much closer than the edge, to the edge than we are now.
Yeah,
and the art expressed that,
Yes. All right, let's go into more detail on the Mithraic mysteries.
Okay, so the Mithraic mysteries show up in the century the last century before Jesus. And the story is that the Roman army picked this up from these Turkish pirates that they had been fighting. And I don't believe this for a minute, okay? I mean, the Romans' great enemies were the Persians. And, all the Persian emperors named themselves after Mithras, right? Mithridates, 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever.
Right.
To me, this is a great historical mystery. And what I believe Mithras is, because when you look at the Roman version of Mithras and you look at the Persian versions, the earlier versions, and Mitra and all these sort of proto-Mithrases, they're very different. The iconography is different. The roles that these gods play are different. I really believe that Mithras is basically Horus repackaged for a Roman audience. And here's the reason. We had Isis and Osiris. Osiris, of course, becomes Serapis. I mean, the Romans recognize Osiris, in this Alexandrian version, right, as Serapis. They don't necessarily. They love these stories, they love these gods, they love these dramas, but they don't necessarily want the Egyptian cultural baggage because they see Egypt as effete, as decadent, as kind of freakish. But Horus is sort of the great figure in all this. I mean, they have Hippocrates, the child with the finger up to the lips and such, but there's no expression there for Horus the elder, the god of the sun. I really believe, particularly that, the tauroctony and things like that. I mean, a lot of this iconography, if you sort of decode it, you can find predecessors, like in the pyramid texts, things like that. So basically, and of course, this is just me, and I don't write about this in the book because it would kind of require a lot of background that I didn't really have room for in the book. But I really see that this Mithras, Roman Mithras, is basically Horus. It's this whole idea of the sun as the phallic, aggressive, alpha male expression. So that the Mithraic mysteries, all male, very stringent, rank, this whole hierarchical system that you have to rise through, but also incredibly wild, dressing up in animal masks and bathing yourselves in bull's blood and all this kind of stuff. I mean, they're not sedate or calm by any stretch of the imagination. And of course, I mean, it's not, you have to sort of read in between the lines. When I read the Mithraic liturgy, there's this whole description of taking in the bitter herbs and spices. Okay, so who knows exactly? I mean, I can't read it in the original language, and I'm sure this is some sort of hallucinogenic compound. Okay, and it's described as being bitter. Okay, so I think you can sort of basically figure out what that's all about. But we have this really hallucinatory, visionary, very wild mystery religion that's made up of soldiers, of businessmen, senators, really, the cream of the crop of the male power structure, and very secretive, very stringent, and this goes all over. I mean, they find Mithraic temples, as far north as Scotland, Germany, all over the world. And the great thing about it is that they were all sort of hidden underground, so they weren't necessarily destroyed. I would sort of argue that the Knights Templar, in a lot of ways, are very much the direct sort of descendant of the Mithraic mysteries, because we also have the whole thing of the cave, this whole idea of worshiping in the cave.
Right. Well, and the Vatican was built on Capitoline Hill, which was an old Mithraic cave hill. Oh,
that's exactly right. Yeah. I mean, Vatican Hill is where the central temple to Mithras was. So, I've always sort of seen that what was created as the Catholic Christian Church is really a combination of the two dominant mystery religions of the time. It's just taking Mithras and Isis and marrying them, combining them, and the mysteries of Isis had, your initiatory mysteries, required the fasting and the shaving of the heads and the begging for alms, this whole process where you separate yourself from society and you basically become a monk and you enter into this really, ecstatic, visionary initiation. But at the same time, they basically churches, the holy water, vespers, bells, smells, the whole deal, the whole liturgy. When you really look at the high mass, And really, the High Mass only sort of exists now in like the Anglo-Catholic churches or maybe the Eastern Orthodox churches. You read descriptions of the ancient Isis churches, and that's really what they are. I mean, it's the same exact thing. The priests calling people to prayers throughout the day, blessing of the holy water. And anybody who's read the book Last Days of Pompeii, there's that whole subplot with the Isis temple in that as well. So I think that it's a political decision to sort of take these two great streams of esoteric thought and popularize them, dumb them down and package them and create a new one world religion out of that. Because Aurelian created the whole Sol Invictus church, the sun god. But I think that you sort of needed to bring in, the Jews were very powerful, the Neoplatonists. There are all these other groups that you needed to bring in to the fold. And everybody sort of needed to have their representation in this new organization. But when you really look at, the Mithraic mysteries, everybody who's seen Zeitgeist knows all about, Christmas and the baptism and the meal of bread and wine, all these sort of things that end up in the church. I mean, there's no mention of any of these things in the Bible, but they end up in the liturgy.
Right. Unfortunately, though, he did a bad job presenting that. But what most people don't realize is that there was a Zeitgeist companion for part one of that actually went into a lot more detail on where the sources were. But when you hear the attacks on part one, they never talk about the companion.
Well, of course not, because the people making those attacks aren't worried about swaying people on the other side. They're worrying about keeping people in their own fold. The worry is that Zeitgeist is going to sort of pick off some of the strayers and the backsliders and things like that. I mean, I think we're even sort of past that point now. I mean, it's just the whole creation is really falling apart day by day. Of course, the economy isn't helping. Because really, American evangelical Christianity is basically the canonization of suburban capitalist consumer culture. It has nothing to do with historical Christianity at all. It's just basically the canonization of convenience and consumerism. So when somebody as flawed as Zeitgeist is, it still is going to upset people who are beginning to stray.
Let's go into the Masons. What can you tell us about the Masons and their tie into the music?
I don't know if the Masons really necessarily tie in directly to this whole musical thing, because they're on this parallel track. They're more interested in politics. They're more interested in revolution. But at the same time, they're appropriating a lot of esoteric symbolism. I think people give the Masons too much credit in a lot of ways. They sort of credit them with a lot of symbolism that they just basically steal. Something comes up and the Masons get excited about it and say they invented it 2,000 years ago, and then it becomes associated with them. The Masons really start off as being based in the Kabbalah and alchemy, these sort of late medieval ideas. And then the whole Egyptology craze comes around, and then they're putting pyramids and all this symbolism in their own iconography and saying they created it 2,000 years ago. I have a really dim view of them. I don't think they're very interesting in a lot of ways. I think they're more interested in privilege and power and sort of buddy backroom kind of stuff.
Right.
You know what I mean? But there is also this mythology that rises, that people like Thomas Paine are saying that they're the direct descendants of the Druids and things like that. But basically what it's doing is that it's setting the stage for a lot of these esoteric ideas to come back into the mainstream. I would not credit the Masons themselves with any of this, rather than the fact that because they're so enthusiastic about appropriating other people's ideas, and because they're so powerful, particularly in the earlier days of the Republic, that it sort of lends a prestige. It makes it okay for people to sort of rediscover these things. And this eventually leads to more esoteric ideas becoming mainstream, spiritualism, Mormonism, the whole idea of the burnt-over district in New York in the early 1800s. But the Masons themselves, I think, are pretty marginal, again, because they're basically shopkeepers and lawyers and things like that. I mean, they're not rock and roll guys at all.
What about the Druids and the Celts? How do they play into music?
Well, if you want to pick apart American popular music, it's basically Celtic music meets African music. It's these two populations that sort of found themselves working the fields at the same time, at the same point in history, and their music kind of collides and creates something new. So the Druids are part of this whole overarching system in the pre-Christian world, that there's a lot of back and forth between the British Isles and the Phoenicians and the Egyptians, because the British Isles are very important in the Bronze Age because the tin mines. So you have a lot of these traders going back and forth up the coast, up to the British Isles, and of course the Romans eventually established this garrison state there. But there's this whole network that goes along with the trade. Missionaries have this interesting habit of following the trade routes. That we saw Buddhist and Hindu missionaries in Alexandria, that they were following the spice trade. And it's a very undervalued part. People want to sort of separate commerce and spirituality. I'm not necessarily sure that you can, that there is this uncomfortable, for some people, connection between the two. So the Druids and the Druidic tradition, of course, is long gone by the time the indentured servants are coming to the North American plantations from the Celtic Rim. But that tradition is still alive and well in the music. And, of course, the folkways and things like Halloween and a lot of these pagan leftovers that come along, particularly around the time of the potato blight and the waves of Irish immigration in the middle part of the 19th century. I think this has an enormous impact on American popular music, almost incalculable. And of course, when they meet their Yoruba cousins, the Yoruba being the direct descendants of the Egyptian mysteries in many important ways, there's something awoken. There's this atavistic impulse that's reawoken and finds an expression in music.
How did the Druids impact American country music?
Well, again, it's
why would it focus more on, say, country music than other types of Western music?
I'm not necessarily sure it does, but it's just country music is where everything is pulled into. Country music country music really is a marketing ploy. It's a marketing.
I was just having that discussion with somebody a couple days ago that it was a marketing ploy.
Yeah, it basically pulls in a host of different folkways, folk music, Western, Appalachian, bluegrass. You name it. It's a whole host of different musical styles, cowboy songs, that coalesce. It really is. Country doesn't exist until radio networks exist. Do you understand what I'm saying? That they go, right. Okay, this is country music. This is for the hicks. They have everything broken down for their marketing meetings and everything like that. And that's how that sort of comes about. But it really is that old Celtic jigs and reels and airs reinvented and mutated.
All right, let's get into some dark stuff. Let's talk about the Yoruba, and let's get into some of Wade Davis's research and his Passage of Darkness on Haitian zombies, some of the good stuff.
The Yoruba traditions, it's the other wing of this great American music mutant, sort of this Lovecraftian mutant that has these two wings from different parts of the world, I guess. Of course, this is the slave trade, the Middle Passage. Again, the original slaves are indentured servants, debtors, people who just unlucky to be born on the wrong side of the tracks. I guess before there were tracks, but they were poor people who come to work the plantations in Massachusetts and in Virginia. But cotton becomes a major crop for the United States. Sugarcane, rice, a whole host of crops. The South is a very fertile area because it's so wet and hot. Things grow very quickly there. You can really fit a lot more into the growing season than you can up in New England. So there's this huge migration, but you need people to work the fields, so that's where the slave trade comes in. And a lot of the slave trade comes from the heartland of the Yoruba people. Now, the Yoruba people, according to some historians, were refugees in a way from the Hyksos invasion of Egypt. That when the Hyksos came in from Syria, that a lot of African people who had emigrated into Egypt had to emigrate back. And what they brought with them were the Egyptian mysteries. And if you look at what is now Santeria and voodoo, that the gods all have their correspondences in the Egyptian mysteries. The practices, the sacrifices of small animals, the icons, the incense, the whole shebang really fits to a T the descriptions, particularly of the Egyptian mysteries. So basically what these people are doing is that they gave them new names, and of course they give them new names again because there's this whole collision between, particularly the Catholic Church and the Yoruba traditions. Santeria is this pejorative term to make fun of this very suspicious attachment to the saints, because the overlords and the overseers, they all realize that these slaves are still worshiping the old gods in this Catholic drag, that they give them these new convenient identities to keep the whips off their backs. And it's very interesting that the heartland of this Yoruba diaspora is Catholic. Louisiana, Haiti, Dominican Republic, Florida. This whole southern quadrant of the American colonization process. But nothing really needs to be said about the incredible influence that this music has. It brings the drums back. The drums had sort of been this lost art. That we still had drums being used for martial music, marching music, but as a popular part of normal folk song, the drum had sort of been marginalized. You had the tambourine, you had sort of this adaptation of the Celtic drum, but it really brings syncopation, rhythm back into the music. And of course, throughout the 19th century, this hybridization process becomes more and more intense. And in the earlier part of the 20th century, we start to see jazz. jazz is taking the chord progressions of Celtic and European music and marrying it to African syncopation. And it's just this incredibly potent blend. Now, as far as, the voodoo and all these sort of things, I mean, this brings us back to this whole idea of, pharmacology, drugs playing a huge part in the development of this culture. Wade Davis in The Serpent and the Rainbow is talking about certain neurotoxins that are developed to create, zombies who are basically, they're not dead brought back to life, but they're basically catatonic. They're, brain damaged, basically, to work the sugar fields of Haiti.
Right. They use the fugu fish with tetrodotoxin and datura and a bunch of other stuff, and
it's really impressive. It's
have you read Davis's book Passage of Darkness?
No, I have not. I have not read that.
That's kind of like the more scientific version of the Serpent and Rainbow one that they ended up popularizing in the movie.
Which isn't very good, by the way. The movie isn't.
No.
It's a little sensationalistic, I thought.
I would agree with that.
But basically, these two great strands of music that are creating this new hybrid in America can have direct lineages back to the ancient mysteries, particularly in Egypt, or in the, it's almost like, the Egyptian part of this ends up with the Yoruba and the Phoenician, Syrian, the Levant ends up, when you listen to Celtic music, a lot of the patterns and things like that, and these arpeggios and whatnot, very similar to Arab music, that the two have a lot of commonalities, very ornate, embroidered musical ideas in a lot of ways, and some of the scales are different, but in a lot of ways are similar. It's particularly the pipes as well. The bagpipe has a very unique sound, but you can hear a lot of pipe music from the Middle East that's very similar in tone. That it sounds like a sheep being strangled, but it's that same tonality, All
right, let's talk about Madame Blavatsky.
Yes, Madame Blavatsky shows up sort of at the tail end of spiritualism. And spiritualism is really important. I wrote a lot about spiritualism in Our Gods Wear Spandex, too, because spiritualism really sort of breaks the monopoly of the priesthood, that religious expression no longer is the exclusive province of the church. And Blavatsky is sort of there to sort of capitalize on that. Blavatsky is a great, she's very much an American figure in that she's all about the packaging. She's all about the promotion and the advertising. She would have been, if she'd been born 100 years later, she would have made a fortune on Wall Street or on Madison Avenue. She was just born at the wrong time. But she brings this sort of new catch-as-catch-can, very syncretic, do-it-yourself religion that's very American. It takes a bit from the East, a bit from the West, a bit from the South, a bit from the North, whatever. I mean, whatever she thinks is going to fit together and create this mystique, is going to work. And I think that it's interesting when you look at the Theosophists, because the people who were involved in the early days of the movement become very disenchanted with Blavatsky and just this whole idea, but they start to, drift off into Buddhism and into Hinduism, and they sort of become the first wave of Western converts into, particularly Indian religion, which I think is tremendously important historically. And sort of pops up again, of course, in the late 60s with the ragas and people like Ravi Shankar and all this music, that the whole idea of this droning sitar ragas as being a great soundtrack for tripping and for smoking pot and for everything like that so ragas really become very important because the psychedelic bands, maybe not even consciously, but are starting to do their own ragas. And this becomes very popular because these all-night dance parties at places like the Fillmore or the UFO Club, the raga gets repackaged for a Western audience. And later on, people like George Harrison get involved with Hare Krishna. The Beatles were involved with TM. So it really, this whole idea of this great exchange between East and West, in particularly between England and India, really starts with theosophy on a popular level. And of course, the theosophists are very involved in Indian independence and things like that. I mean, Gandhi himself arises from this nexus that comes in Blavatsky's wake.
All right, let's get into Aleister Crowley. How did he affect music and the whole movement?
Crowley, in a lot of ways, is sort of the first rock star. He's the first figure of the 20th century that becomes famous for being infamous. He shows that there's money to be made in shock and outrage. I'm not necessarily sure that the early rock and rollers wanted to be shocking or outrageous, but to a sort of sleepwalking suburban America, that's how they were seen. And the whole idea of hedonism for its own sake maybe doesn't necessarily originate with Crowley, but he popularizes it. Certainly there are no shortage of figures in rock and roll that are inspired by him. But as a matter of fact, there's a much more direct and interesting influence he has. Two of them, actually. First is a guy named Harry Smith. And Harry Smith is, Thelemite, involved in the OTO, great admirer of Crowley's. He's also a music archivist, and he assembles this landmark collection of American folk music that really turns people back on in the 50s, where everything had become very saccharine and stringy, and Doris Day and all this horrible music. He really reawakens people to raw, rural American music. And of course, he comes from the loins, as it were, of Crowley himself. So that's a very direct connection he has. But also, a little bit later, rock video springs really essentially from the work of Kenneth Anger. I mean, Kenneth Anger sort of creates the whole template for rock video with his films in the 60s, particularly Scorpio Rising, which uses all this old rock and roll as the soundtrack. People like Martin Scorsese said that this film had a tremendous influence on him. When he does these montages in his films set to these rock and roll songs, that he was drawing on the influence of Kenneth Anger's work. And of course, a little bit later, he starts mixing with the rock and rollers, Rolling Stones. The story might be apocryphal, but it's said that Mick Jagger wrote Sympathy for the Devil under the direct influence of Kenneth Anger. And a little bit later, he falls in with Led Zeppelin. And of course, Jimmy Page is a huge Crowleyite himself. So it takes a long time, but, and that's the way these things usually work their way into the mainstream. But Crowley is seen as this wickedest man alive. Most of his reputation is legendary. It really creates this whole idea of the bad boy as hero, and that becomes very, very important in rock and roll. I'm sure that Crowley himself would have hated rock and roll. He was an elitist in that regard. I'm sure he would have just completely despised it. And much in the same way that Anton LaVey is seen as this influence to all these satanic metal guys, but he hates that music. He really does. So it's kind of ironic in that regard.
Why don't we get into some of the rock bands, and you sort of create a system of, or you, in your book, you break down all of the modern rock bands into groupings compared with the ancient mysteries. Why don't you explain that and talk about some of these bands and what you know about them?
Well, this is where I think, the powers of hallucinogenic compounds to kick things up from the deepest depths of the collective unconscious comes in. And this, in some ways, is the origin point of the book. That when I was looking at rock bands, not only did I see the best rock artists as shamanistic priests, people like Jim Morrison, Bob Marley, Joe Strummer, John Lennon, all these incredibly charismatic and powerful people who channeled this energy. But I also began to see that these different acts, these different streams of music really have their correspondences to the ancient mysteries. And I don't think this is just this facetious, just this contrived connection I'm making. I think what this has to do with is this has to do with the deep strands of human expression, and how different ideas coalesce themselves into different archetypes. I'm not just being silly. I'd been accused of just this very superficial look, just to sort of shoehorn these groups into these categories, and that's not it at all. What I'm trying to say here, and I say this repeatedly, which is kind of frustrating that I got, but is that, the human psyche has ways of expressing itself that eventually we, it becomes lumped, it drifts in a way to these different categories. It's just the same sort of thing I did with our gods or Hispanics, of drawing these basic archetypes that you can sort of plug all these superheroes into. And of course, that's a little bit smaller sampling. But I really began to see that the reason why these different mystery cults arose is that they suited different needs for different people, okay? That, the Dionysians have different needs than the Isis mysteries. That the Mithraic mysteries serve a different purpose for a different group of people than the mysteries of Kybele and Attis. Because people are different, and because people like to associate with people with whom they feel they have commonality, it's going to reflect itself in our art. This is not some silly mind game I'm playing here. This is really about how people choose to organize themselves and how this expresses itself in art. So I talked about Apollo, and Apollo, of course, is the god of music. He's the first rock star, as it were. And Apollo is very much a holdover from ancient shamanism. And of course, we have all these things like the oracles, and the frenzy, and the paeans, and all these things where Apollo very much has this dual nature. And when I looked at groups that I sort of put into this category, the Beatles, the Beach Boys, U2, that there is always this, things are not as cut and dry as they seem, that there is this sort of dual nature to these acts. The Dionysians, of course, it's a no-brainer. I mean, you're talking your Rolling Stones, Jim Morrison, Led Zeppelin, that whole wild man idea that people trace to the blues, but really goes back a lot farther than the blues. Of course, Demeter is the Earth Mother, but there's also this aspect of suffering. And that's why I sort of chose Tina Turner as the great avatar of this modern Demeter archetype, because she's this earthy figure, almost elemental figure, but at the same time, this is a woman who's had experienced incredible suffering in her life. Janis Joplin's another great example of that. And the flip side of that is sort of the Isis. There's this great poster from the 1960s, and it's Janis Joplin and Grace Slick, and that to me is such a great. It's the two sides of women in rock and roll. The witchy woman, Grace Slick, the drugs, this whole mystique that she has about her, or had about her.
Yeah, you put the Susie and the Banshees and the Cocteau Twins in there, too.
Yes, because I see them very much as the direct descendants of Grace Slick. When you listen to a song, of course, everyone knows songs like White Rabbit and Somebody to Love. When you listen to a lot of her other songs, is that very much that witchy, dark, mysterious, droning, very confrontational aspect to it. I mean, Grace Slick is a person, and she went on the Smothers Brothers show, in blackface. She was a very confrontational figure, but she also had this magic to her. And I think, again, you draw this this lineage. And that's why I sort of place Stevie Nicks after Grace Slick, because Stevie Nicks is really picking up where she leaves off. And it's interesting as well, because you have this period in the 70s, with Jefferson Starship and Fleetwood Mac, they're both these reinventions of these 60s wild, crazy rock and roll. It's this repackaging and this sort of, but they're playing off the same archetype, the sort of, it becomes they can't share the same space. Grace Slick eventually becomes a much more, Jefferson Starship becomes much more watered down. She sort of loses that edge. But Susie, and really Kate Bush is another important figure here, because Kate Bush is all about drugs and magic and sex and just all this crazy stuff. I mean, all these songs that she's singing about are based in mysticism and everything like that. But she also has that, she has the Corsican sister, as it were. She has the dark expression in Susie and the Banshees, who are drawing on Hammer horror. They're drawing on the Velvet Underground. They're drawing on, sort of this Weimar Germany decadence. But interestingly enough, but then, it's this lineage, it's this progression. It's really fascinating how it works, because the next evolution is to the Cocteau Twins, who start off really as a Susie and the Banshees copy band, essentially. But they have this singer who's so unique and channels this very strange energy. One of the things I talk about on the blog, my blog, The Secret Sun, by the way, is this bizarre, when you talk about how archetypes replay themselves in the modern world, Elizabeth Fraser, who's the singer for the Cocteau Twins, had this relationship with a singer named Jeff Buckley. And it's interesting because what brought them together is that Elizabeth Fraser had covered a song by his father, who had died, I believe when he was 28, a song called Song to the Siren. And this whole archetype of the siren, the mermaid, this very deadly but alluring archetype. She sings a song called Lorelei, which is another, that's a German siren. All the sort of watery, underwater imagery that she brings, drags along with her somehow. And this brings the singer, Jeff Buckley, into her orbit. And interestingly enough, they have this relationship, and then they have a breakup, and she basically produces this love letter to him. It's called Rilke and Dreams, because she, compared him to Rilke. And it's basically, I'm sorry you left me. And it's, interestingly enough, it's one of the few times where she's actually singing clear, coherent lyrics rather than this sort of glossolalia that she comes out with. But the fascinating thing to me about this, and when you talk about the power of synchronicity, this Rilke and Dreams video starts off with this very ominous shot of this rushing river. And if anybody knows how the Jeff Buckley story ends, he drowns in the Mississippi, right below the Memphis Pyramid. And you talk about this whole idea of archetypes. And when I point to that story as this whole, somewhere, there has to be a myth about the great the troubadour who tempts the siren and is brought to his doom because of that. It's an incredible. I mean, just on an archetypal level, it's amazing. But anyway, that's this whole Isis. Sadly enough, I mean, one of the reasons I wrote this book is that we've really lost sight of these archetypes. This is really the classic era of rock that I'm talking about. And I think one of the problems that we have now is that we've become so postmodern and so mix and match and so catch as catch can that bands today, no matter how good they are, they're not resonating. And the reason they're not resonating is that they aren't tapping into the same energy that these classic rock bands were tapping into, I think, almost unconsciously. And one of the things I point to in the book, people might laugh at it, but I think it's incredibly undervalued, was the popularity of the Sword and Sandal movies in the late 50s and the early 60s. And there's a sort of interim period between the tail end of the first wave of rock and roll and the British invasion. And what we see filling this void in youth culture, Hercules and Jason and the Argonauts, and all these films that are very popular, the TV, drive-ins, whatever you want to see them, are bringing back all of this paganism, this body lust. It's all about muscle men and incredibly beautiful Italian women, dancing, and these sort of quasi reenactments of mystery cult celebrations, the dancing girls and the torches and all this kind of stuff. I mean, kids are soaking this up. And this is the power of the unconscious mind. They might not necessarily be processing this consciously, but all these archetypes are playing in their brains. And as soon as they start taking LSD-25 or whatever, smoking their first joint, I mean, synapses are firing and everything is, it's just going to light up. And I would argue, and a lot of people might criticize me for it, but, that whole 6-year immersion, because it really starts off with the first Steve Reeves Hercules movie in I think it was 1958, and then begins to really peter out. Jason and the Argonauts is the great archetypal movie of this, but it's really sort of on the tail end of this, because really, say 64, 65, we're really not seeing these movies much at all anymore. A little bit later we see Julius Caesar and things like that, but it's not as lusty and as pagan as the Italians are. The Italians at this point in time are just pumping just pure testosterone and estrogen into the American teenager's mind. As undervalued as it is, this is why we start to see words like Dionysian, which you don't see describing Elvis or Little Richard or whatever, start to be used to describe Mick Jagger and Jim Morrison and all these other people.
Fascinating story.
Thank you.
Well, what do you think is the single most important concept from your research that you would like people to take away from this interview?
Basically what I'm saying with this book, and I'm saying with Spandex, and I say a lot on the blog, is that the surface details change, but at the core, human expression has not really changed all that much. We just repackage it. We repackage it and think we have invented it, but that's not what happens. We're just taking older ideas and putting a new spin on them. And if you draw it back to its roots, to the antecedents of all this, it's going to really enrich your concept of culture. Culture to me is really, people think it's just entertainment or whatever. Culture is much deeper than that. It's much more important than that. It's all about the expression of our psyches, and that's, of course, that's the definition of psychedelia. I think that, again, when religion became politics, when we began to worship the state and we began to worship law, that we started to lose sight of a lot of really powerful aspects of our psyches. And it's interesting to me that, every time the Western world rises to a new apex, that these archetypes reemerge. Look at the Renaissance, The Renaissance is really the rise of Europe. It's the rise of Europe, and that leads into the imperial and colonial age and all this sort of thing, the Industrial Revolution, blah, blah, blah. But all of a sudden, we're seeing depictions of the ancient gods everywhere. Because the ancient gods, they represent these higher ideals. And the neoclassical explosion during the Victorian era, again, it's another great example of this. When we're sort of collapsing into ourselves and becoming gloomy and self-absorbed, that's when we begin to worship the law and the state. But when these forces within us are sort of unleashed, that's when these other archetypes begin to play across the great vast movie screen of our minds. It's this visual that I keep picturing in my mind of this parade of nymphs and dryads and maenads and and gods and demigods, how they just sort of they explode, when we're reaching sort of a new height. And I think that one of the reasons I wrote this book is that I wanted to reintroduce people to these concepts, because we've definitely lost sight of it. And that's why rock and roll doesn't really matter to kids anymore. It's not because they have so many other things, because they always had so many other things. 20 years ago, we had video games. Maybe they weren't as fancy or whatever, but they were everywhere. You know what I mean?
Right.
People make excuses why rock and roll or whatever isn't really resonating with.
Well, not only that, but it's, they're playing the same classic rock shit over and over and over, and it's like you can only take so much of it after a while. You need to hear some new influence in there, something good and clean that sounds great,
Well, the problem is that there's nothing great waiting in the wings right now. There's a lot of good, there's a lot of very good, But I think when you look at rock and roll, in a lot of ways, we had rock and roll, as it were, in the late 50s, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley, Fats Domino, Buddy Holly, on and on and on. But people tend to overlook that it was pretty much dead, by the time Kennedy comes into office. What happens is that there's this group of people in a very limited piece of real estate, which would be southern England, who grow up, in this post-war period of rations and of a very highly regimented society. And rock and roll is seen as this deliverance from the dreary, grim, boring, dead world that they're immersed in. America is this promised land to them. And, it's like so many of the great figures of rock, it's like from Liverpool to London, all these guys that are people, are still filling stadiums today. These guys are pushing 70 now, but they're more, I don't know, they plugged into something. I think it had a lot to do with repression. Kids don't feel, oppressed anymore. They don't feel weighed down. They don't feel limited. Maybe the problem.
Well, unless they wake up to the whole corporate culture, but that's a whole different subject.
Well, that that has just different ways to sort of anesthetize them. I think that it was so much harder back, in the 50s and 60s to sort of escape, because you didn't have quite so many distractions to take your mind off of it all. But it's really fascinating to me, that so many of the great figures, they all knew each other. They went to the same art schools. It was a very interesting explosion. And I think so much of what came after was just basically following in their footsteps. And maybe we're so far removed from that great explosion that everything begins to lose power. It's like you take a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. By the time you're done, it's going to be illegible. And this is old time Xerox technology, I guess.
Right, not digital.
Yeah, not non-digital, analog. I think in order for people to reinvigorate the culture, they need to understand where it comes from. I think, don't forget that David Bowie and John Lennon and Eric Clapton and all these guys, they all were reading the classics in elementary school. The schools were different then. These guys,
they actually taught the classics. They actually taught critical thinking and things like that back then, and they don't anymore.
No, they don't. So, people, if you want to learn it, you have to take it upon yourself. You have to take it upon yourself to dig into these things. And it's so mind-boggling to me that we have basically the Library of Alexandria available at your fingertips 24 hours a day. And, what do people, people are just texting each other or tweeting each other back and forth. It's like, it's mind-boggling to me. It
is to me too.
It's such a waste of this incredible gift, but maybe it's so available that people don't appreciate it. But, maybe this Orwellian future that we're looking down the barrel of will be a blessing in disguise, because people will start to see what's meaningful and what is not, and what's valuable and what is not. I think that, they're just responding to their schooling, which taught them that self-esteem is more important than accomplishment,
It's got provisional self-esteem. It's
more important to feel better, feel good about yourself than to feel good about yourself because you've accomplished something.
Right.
It's all engineered to create docile little corporate cretins. Of course, but they don't need it in America. They don't need docile corporate cretins anymore, because all the jobs are going over to Asia. So who knows? Who knows what will happen? Could be very interesting. But one thing I said in another interview is that you're not truly impoverished until you surrender your culture. If you have your culture, you have riches. When you surrender it, when you surrender your history, that's when you become truly impoverished.
All right. Would you like to give out your book titles and website and any contact information you may or may not want people to have?
Well, the Secret Sun blog is open for business. secretsun.blogspot.com. There's going to be a lot of information for anybody who's into sci-fi and stuff like that. I've been doing a lot on Star Wars lately. The books, Secret History of Rock and Roll, Our Gods Wear Spandex, Complete X-Files, and the Clash book is out of print for the time being. So you have to pay like $90 if you want to get a copy of that. But I think that the two will keep you busy, Spandex and Secret History of Rock and Roll. But again, I invite all your listeners to come over to the Secret Sun. We do a lot on Gnosticism. We do a lot on theogens, a whole host of topics that I've linked to a lot of your stuff on several occasions. So I'm sure maybe even some of your fans are familiar with the blog already.
Thank you so much for your time, Chris, and I look forward to more of your work.
Thank you.
All right.
Same goes for you as well. Definitely.